My name is Raymond Cole. I'm 84 years old, and I've walked the same stretch of Main Street every Friday since the Reagan years. That morning, I left the corner store with bread, cough drops, and a postcard for my great-grandson. The sidewalk was tight near the bar, packed with chrome motorcycles and louder mouths. As I passed, my jacket brushed a handlebar barely a graze. Before I could speak, one of them, a woman in a leather vest with rage behind her, grin-shoved me hard. I hit the pavement. My bread scattered into the gutter. They laughed like it was a game. No one stepped in. Not the bartender, not the folks on the patio, not even the man who locked eyes with me and then turned away. I sat up slowly, bloody lip, torn bag, and pride spilling onto the street. I pulled myself onto the bench just outside the bar, hands shaking not from pain, but from something colder. I've taken hits before. Hell, I've had shrapnel dug out of my thigh without anesthesia. But this wasn't about injury. This was about being nothing to everyone around me. People walked by. A man with a coffee glanced at me, then crossed the street. A young woman looked down at her phone like it had just saved her. No one offered a napkin. No one asked if I was okay. I pressed my sleeve to the corner of my lip, tasted rust, and watched the bread soak up motor oil in the gutter. Inside the bar, they went right back to laughing. The woman who shoved me lit a cigarette and mimicked my stumble like it was part of a comedy routine. Another one yelled, "Old man should stay off the streets." I didn't answer, didn't raise my voice. I just sat there with my jacket zipped to the throat and the weight of humiliation sitting heavier than my own bones. My cane had rolled a few feet away. I leaned forward, reached slowly, and winced not from pain, but from what it felt like to be seen and still dismissed. Like I had become part of the scenery, cracked pavement, faded signs, and another forgotten thing nobody fixes. A teenager walked past with headphones in. I raised my hand an inch, maybe just instinct. He didn't notice, or maybe he did and kept walking anyway. Back in '71, I helped pull 3 brothers from a burning Humvee. The medals didn't mean much, but their voices still echo in my sleep. Now, I couldn't even get a stranger to look me in the eye. I sat up, breathed in slow. The winter air bit deep into my lungs. Somewhere behind me, a beer bottle clinked against concrete. Laughter followed. I didn't need their apology. I needed to remember who I was. And I had one call left to make. I reached into my coat pocket with fingers that had twisted bolts in war zones and held babies after funerals. The phone I pulled out was old, flip style, screen cracked. One button worked, the only one I needed. It was labeled Eagle 1, Emergency. I didn't hesitate, I pressed it once. No words, no explanation. Then I put the phone away and leaned back on the bench. I didn't stand. I didn't shout. I didn't demand justice from the strangers who couldn't bother to care. I just sat still, like I was waiting for a bus no one else could see. One leg crossed over the other, hands resting on my cane, eyes on the road ahead. Inside the bar, someone turned up the music again. The Karens were still laughing, oblivious or too bold to care. One of them mimicked me limping, dragging her leg like it was a joke. The bartender gave her a high five. 5 minutes passed. Then the earth began to hum. It started beneath my boots, a low vibration, like distant thunder rolling just beneath the crust of the street. A wind picked up from the north, crisp, unnatural. It didn't smell like winter. It smelled like aviation fuel and memory. A couple at the cafe across the road looked around. One man cupped his hand over his eyes, squinting toward the horizon. Then the sound thickened. Whomp whomp whomp. Rotors. Windows rattled. Car alarms chirped. Birds exploded from the treetops behind the bar like they'd been warned first. The Karen at the corner table dropped her cigarette. Another one's smile died in her throat. And then it came. A Black Hawk helicopter, matte black, low, angry, merged over the trees like judgment on wings. It dropped toward the open field behind the strip of shops, kicking up a hurricane of leaves and dust as it descended. Blades screamed against the cold sky. Every head turned. Before the first camera phone could unlock, an unmarked black SUV screeched to a stop in front of the bar. 4 doors opened simultaneously. Boots hit the pavement. 12 men, tactical gear, faces unreadable, steps silent and sure, not one weapon raised, but they moved like people who had been in the business of consequence their entire lives. They didn't shout. They didn't ask. They arrived like punctuation, final, bold, and undeniable. People inside the bar froze, the laughter vanished. A woman ducked behind the counter. One man peeked through the blinds and backed away as if he'd seen a ghost. Still, I didn't move. I just closed my eyes for a moment and let the wind press against my face, felt it whip through the holes in my old jacket, the same one I wore during my second tour. I heard the familiar whir of authority that I had once served beneath, but this time, it wasn't coming for a mission. It was coming for me. The SUV's back door opened. A single man stepped out. No helmet, no sunglasses, just quiet fury built into every inch of his posture. He moved with command, not swagger, broad-shouldered, jaw tight, stride, purposeful. His boots struck the pavement like a clock ticking toward judgment. He was younger than me, but not by much, maybe 55. A trace of gray at the temple, same sharp eyes I used to know in the mirror before age dulled them. He walked past the stunned crowd like they didn't exist. And when he reached the bench, he knelt. "Dad," he said, voice low but steady, brushing dried blood gently from my cheek with the side of his thumb. "I got here as fast as I could." I nodded once, that was all. There were no salutes, no dramatic music, just a shift in the air, like something sacred had entered the scene, and everyone bystander or bully could feel it. The woman who shoved me had stepped outside just in time to watch a dozen men form a semicircle behind my son, locking down the block without needing to speak. The people of that town hadn't seen a war, but now, they were about to witness what happened when one followed you home. He didn't need to be introduced. The moment he stepped out of the SUV, the wind seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. No one in that crowd knew his name yet, but everyone felt it: authority without arrogance, presence without performance. That was my son, Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Cole. He moved like gravity followed him. Each step was silent, measured, like the street had been laid down just to meet his boots. Not a word passed his lips. Not a single glance wasted on the gawking crowd or the cameras now raised in trembling hands. His eyes found mine across the street, and without a break in stride, he crossed. He didn't salute, he didn't shout orders. He knelt. "Dad," he said quietly. His voice hadn't changed since he was 8 years old, whispering secrets after bedtime, but now it carried the weight of command, years of battlefield smoke, and hard-earned respect. He reached up and wiped the dried blood from the corner of my mouth with the sleeve of his uniform. "I got here as fast as I could." I looked at him, just nodded, no words needed. My heart said what my voice couldn't. Behind him, his unit spread across the block like a silent wave. They didn't threaten, they didn't posture, but their presence was louder than any weapon. The bar's front door creaked open, and the Karen who'd shoved me earlier poked her head out, then froze. Her smirk died somewhere between the helicopter blades and the dozen boots surrounding the building. My son didn't need to point, he didn't need to raise his voice. The town saw, the town understood. They saw the patch on his shoulder. U.S. Army Special Operations Command. They saw the row of service ribbons above his heart. They saw a son born in my silence and hardened by the same world that once cheered boys off to war and forgot them the minute they limped home. He didn't come as a soldier today. He came as a son. The last time I saw him in uniform was 5 years ago, when he gave the eulogy at his mother's funeral. I'd thought then that grief had grown into him like bone. But now I saw something else: fury, not loud, but cold and righteous, not for revenge, for me. He turned to the crowd. His eyes didn't scan the bystanders, they pierced straight through them. "Which one of you," he said, voice still low, "put hands on a veteran?" The silence was instant. People who had laughed minutes ago now shifted uncomfortably. Glasses clinked behind lowered blinds. Phones kept recording, but hands holding them began to shake. No one wanted to meet his eyes. The woman who had pushed Mitha one in the red leather vest stepped forward half a pace. "He bumped my bike," she muttered, her voice brittle with shrinking bravado. "It was just a push, just a joke." Malcolm didn't flinch. "That man," he said, pointing at me without turning his head, "has seen more death than any of you have seen Mondays." A murmur passed through the bystanders. A boy near the cafe whispered something to his dad. I watched the man's face shift from confusion to recognition, then something deeper. Shame, maybe. Regret. I didn't want this to be a scene, but it was too late. My blood had dried in public. My dignity had been trampled where everyone could see. And now, everyone was seeing it. Malcolm didn't move closer to her. He didn't need to. His presence alone did the heavy lifting. "You shoved a man who spent 3 decades making sure you had the right to stand here free." You laughed while he bled. He paused. "Do you know what we call people like that in the field?" She said nothing. "Dead weight." She lowered her gaze. One of Malcolm's men stepped back, speaking into his radio. A few moments later, the wail of sirens approached slow, deliberate. A police cruiser rolled into view, lights on but sirens off, as if it, too, understood the moment needed gravity, not noise. The officers exited, quiet, cautious, one glance at my son, and they knew. He pointed at the Karen. The cuffs went on without protest. She didn't speak, didn't resist. Her confidence had cracked like glass under pressure. Her friends faded into the background, suddenly far less interested in defending the joke. And for the first time that day, the block was still. As the cops led her toward the cruiser, Malcolm turned back to me. I looked up at him, and in his eyes, I saw everything I thought the world had forgotten. Not just the war, not just the sacrifice, but the worth of a man who'd given his best years to a country that sometimes refused to look him in the eye. He saw me. And now, so did everyone else. Malcolm turned back toward the bar, his voice steady but edged with steel. "Which one of you," he asked, loud enough for the whole block to hear, shoved a senior veteran to the ground? There was no echo, just silence, stillness. People froze mid-step, caught between disbelief and dread. No one answered. For a few seconds, it seemed like the crowd hoped he'd just move on, that the sight of a bleeding old man on the curb wasn't enough to ignite consequence. But Malcolm wasn't asking to be answered. He was giving the guilty a chance to come forward. And then, reluctantly, one of the women stepped out from the small pack gathered near the door. Blonde ponytail, red leather vest, smirk melting into nervous defiance. Her name, at least what I heard them call her earlier, was Heather. She shrugged. "He bumped my Harley," she muttered. "Should have watched it." The same tone she might have used if I'd spilled her drink, like a life meant nothing if it stumbled into her pride. Malcolm's jaw flexed, but he didn't shout, he didn't clench his fists or raise a finger, he didn't have to. He turned slightly and said only 3 words: record, detain, document. The moment hung like breath before a storm. His men moved instantly, no weapons drawn, no need for aggression. 2 soldiers approached Heather, not rushing, not threatening, just precise. One recorded everything with a body cam. Another read a short statement aloud. "Civil violation of a protected person, incident logged, evidence secured." Heather's eyes widened. "What the hell is this?" she barked, suddenly stepping back. "This is accountability," one soldier said calmly. A civilian might have raised their voice, might have yelled something dramatic, but these weren't men who needed to perform justice. They executed it. The soldiers didn't lay a hand on her yet. They waited, respectfully but firmly, for the proper authorities, and as if summoned by the weight of those words, the police cruiser turned onto the block again. This time, it didn't cruise past or slow with indifference. It stopped, hard. 2 local officers stepped out. Their faces had changed from the usual bored expressions of small-town patrol to something else: awareness, hesitation, maybe even fear. Because when federal boots are on the ground and tactical gear is at the ready, small-town politics don't hold up. Malcolm pointed once. Her. The officers didn't ask why. They didn't question jurisdiction. They saw the silent power of 12 trained men flanking the bar, and the unmistakable glare of someone who'd spent more nights under fire than they'd spent behind a desk. Heather backed away another step, panic bleeding into her voice. Wait, hold on, this is ridiculous. It was just an accident. I didn't mean anything by it. But it was too late. The officers approached, firm but measured. You're being detained for assault on a senior citizen, one said, and obstruction in a federal protection matter. Cuffs clicked behind her back. Her face twisted, confused, betrayed by a world she thought would always let her laugh at people like me. But he bumped my bike, she shouted, writhing now, desperate to turn herself into the victim. Malcolm spoke again, this time quieter, but the words landed like a gavel. And how many people bumped into you in high school, Heather? How many did you shove to the ground while everyone laughed and said nothing? She froze. Because he wasn't talking to her anymore. He was talking to everyone. To every face in the crowd that had turned away when I fell, to the man who locked the door when he saw me stumble, to the waitress who peered through the glass, then disappeared like I'd never existed. You think silence makes you innocent, Malcolm continued, but silence is a choice, and you all chose. The shame settled heavier than the cuffs. I watched them lead her to the cruiser. No one clapped, no one cheered. There was nothing celebratory about it. It was justice. Earned, delivered, and unflinching. Malcolm returned to my side, knelt again. His hand rested gently on my shoulder. You okay, Dad? I nodded, but truthfully, I wasn't sure. The physical pain had faded into the background. What lingered was something deeper, the ache of decades spent proving worth to people who never bothered to see it. Yet in that moment, I felt something shift not just in me, but around me. The crowd had begun to change shape. A man near the edge of the sidewalk took off his hat and held it over his heart. A woman pulled her child close, whispered something into his ear while pointing at me. A teenage boy stepped forward, his body stiff, and offered me a salute. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I saw their eyes, not just filled with sympathy but recognition. They had finally seen me. Not the slow steps or the old jacket or the black skin weathered by sun and service, but the man behind all of it. Heather sat in the back of the cruiser, silent now. Her world had cracked open, not from the weight of my cane, but from the force of the truth she never expected to face. And Malcolm? He didn't gloat. He didn't bask in victory. He stood by my side, a son who had watched his father get knocked down and decided the world would not look away again. The cruiser had barely turned the corner when the silence on Main Street shifted from tension to revelation. Heather was gone, but the memory of what she'd done lingered in the dust that still hung in the air. Her laughter, once the loudest sound on the block, had evaporated like steam off the concrete. Now, all that remained was the stillness of people confronting their own reflections. Malcolm stood beside me, silent. He didn't need to say more. His presence had done the talking, but there were still things that needed to be heard. He stepped forward. Just a few paces into the street. No microphone, no platform, just boots on pavement, and a truth that had been ignored for far too long. That man you watched bleed, he said calmly, is Sergeant Raymond Cole. He turned to face the crowd, and for the first time, the bystanders looked back with something real in their eyes, shame, maybe, or recognition. He served in Panama, in Fallujah, and in Somalia. He fixed Black Hawks under fire, pulled men from burning wreckage, carried brothers on his back when they couldn't stand on their own. Malcolm paused. The wind tugged at his jacket. His voice was low, steady, but it carried weight, like the rotors still thumping faintly in people's chests. And today, he was shoved to the ground like trash, while you watched. The words didn't accuse. They convicted. A man in a blue apron slowly stepped forward. He was the bar owner. He recognized him. I'd seen him wipe glasses behind that counter for a decade, never once nodding when I passed. He opened his mouth to speak, but Malcolm raised a hand, not to silence him, but to continue. My father didn't fight back. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten, because strength like his doesn't scream. He turned slightly, his eyes sweeping the sidewalk. It remembers, it endures, it teaches. People looked away. Some stared at their shoes. A woman near the coffee shop held her son a little tighter. And now you've seen it. He walked back toward me, and took a knee again, not because he had to, but because respect, when real, is never loud and never forced. He leaned closer and said, "Not for the cameras, not for the crowd, but just for me. You taught me what a man is, Dad. You don't need to say a thing. The whole town just heard it." I looked into his eyes, and I saw the boy I raised, the same one who once built a toy helicopter from broken radio parts and carried it everywhere. Now he flew the real ones. Now he flew for men like me. Behind us, something unexpected happened. A woman stepped forward, mid-60s, hair streaked gray. She held a white handkerchief in her hand, fingers trembling. She looked at me, eyes downcast, then knelt halfway. "I should have said something," she whispered. "When she shoved you, I looked away. I'm sorry." She offered me the cloth. I took it gently, nodded once. My throat was tight, not from anger, not even from pain. From finally being seen. Then came another. A teenage boy removed his baseball cap and stood at attention. It was awkward, but it was honest. His eyes stayed on mine. Then a retired sailor stepped up, stiff posture and weathered skin. He saluted sharply. A former Air Force officer joined him, then a firefighter, then a mailman. Within minutes, a quiet line had formed. Veterans, civilians, strangers all, shoulder to shoulder, facing me, not cheering, not shouting, just standing. Like my silence had spoken a language they hadn't understood until now. Malcolm stood back and let it happen. His team didn't move. They knew this moment wasn't for them. It was for the man on the bench, the man who had once fought for a country that forgot his name until now. And I? I sat a little straighter, not out of pride, out of relief. Because after decades of walking through towns where my service was invisible, my skin suspicious, and my silence mistaken for weakness, they were finally listening. Not to a story, not to a speech. To me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. The woman with the handkerchief sat beside me, quiet, shoulders hunched. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She offered presence. That was enough. Heather's absence felt heavy, but I didn't need her apology. What she gave me unintentionally was something more permanent. A mirror. For the town, for herself. And for a son who saw a man on a bench and remembered what the uniform underneath had always meant. Malcolm sat next to me then, resting his elbows on his knees. "You didn't fall today," he said softly. "You reminded them how to stand." I didn't answer, just looked at the small boy saluting with his cap, hand trembling, eyes full of wonder. Because somewhere in that child's future, I saw a town that might never forget again. A week passed, but the weight of that day never left. By Tuesday, the incident had circled through local news, then national headlines. Not because it was flashy, there was no brawl, no screaming, no viral outburst. Just a video. An old man bleeding on the sidewalk, a silent crowd, and a helicopter shadow falling over the bar, like justice arriving from the sky. The town tried to move on, but something had changed. The mayor called Malcolm directly. Said the city council wanted to hold a recognition event, not for press, not for politics, just for me. My son asked only one thing: if it's about honoring him, not using him, he'll be there. That Saturday, the town green was transformed. Rows of chairs, a makeshift wooden stage, and a middle school choir rehearsing the national anthem. Nothing grand, but it felt real. I came in a wheelchair not because I couldn't walk, but because, for once, someone offered to push me, and I let them. When the crowd stood, it wasn't automatic, it was deliberate, honest, the kind of rising that came from the spine, not obligation. The mayor gave a speech, but what people remembered was Malcolm. He stepped to the mic, paused, and said, "My father never asked for applause, he never asked to be remembered. But today, this town remembers not just a man, but what he stood for when no one stood for him." He turned toward me, eyes glassy. "You didn't need to raise your voice, Dad. Your life said enough." And for 4 full minutes, nobody sat, nobody clapped. They just stood. Not for the medals. Not for the helicopter. But for the silence that taught them something louder than words ever could. 6 months later, the corner of Main Street and Maple looked nothing like the place I bled. Where cracked pavement once held a man forgotten, now stood a bronze plaque, mounted on a polished stone base. It read, "In honor of Sergeant Raymond Cole." He stood so others could see. Below it, in smaller letters, "Dignity doesn't retire, it remembers who we are." People paused when they passed. Not everyone, but enough. Students left flowers on Veterans Day. A local painter added my silhouette to a mural of community heroes next to a teacher, a nurse, a mailman. The city renamed the park behind the bar, Cole Field. I still walked there every Friday, same boots, same jacket, slower now, but something had changed. A teenager would nod respectfully. A child would wave. A father would whisper to his son, "That's him." Sometimes, I'd see Heather, quiet, carrying groceries for a veteran or cleaning the park sign. She never said much, neither did I. We didn't need to. Once, Malcolm came back and sat beside me on the bench. He looked at the plaque, then at the people. "You didn't raise your voice, Dad," he said, "but somehow, they all heard you." I smiled faintly, watching a boy salute the statue. Maybe silence isn't empty after all. Maybe it echoes.